What's the biggest trap they fall into when building an HR tech?
I think the biggest challenge in building an HR tech, this is true of founders or anybody kind of new to the space, is that, we that are sort of drawn to this space are not necessarily like everybody else. We are often lifelong learners. We might be the kind of person that would take a Coursera course or, maybe even read the manual, right? That's just a small portion of people that are willing to take the time to develop personally. The learning space in particular is generally more of a vitamin than a pain pill.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ignite podcast. Today we're thrilled to have Jared Goralnick on the mic. He is a product leader and multi-time founder and the CEO and co-founder of Your 360 AI, a voice AI platform for rethinking 360 feedback and personal growth at work. Thanks for coming on, Jared.
Thanks, Brian. Thrilled to be here.
So I'd love to get your origin story. What's your background?
Well, my background, I guess, is similar to many of those tech entrepreneurs. I was an early geek, early to technology. My dad worked at Digital Credit Union, which you hear the first word in there. It is, in fact, digital. So he had access to a lot of tech. I was very much one of those people that was, 8086, working on BASIC, going to computer camps where I was doing programming. My first money that I got in the door was selling, burned MP3s, like one speed CD burning kind of stuff.
I remember when 2X came out. Remember that? It was like, okay, I could burn it twice as fast now.
That was a big deal. I remember when 14.4 turned into 28.8. I mean, it was, I was on bulletin boards, all that stuff. So yeah, I was just very much early to the tech world. I mean, I grew up outside of Boston and kind of suburbia. Computers were a big part of my life. I was also really into things like philosophy and running, which I ended up majoring in philosophy. Maybe we'll get there or not, but
because they didn't offer a running major, obviously.
And I would not have been a world-class successful person in that, but it is something that grounds me. I'm very much, I think I was the Energizer Bunny when I was growing up. So it very much slowed me down a little bit in terms of the rest of the world or the rest of life. So it was a good thing for me.
What is it about running? I've never been a runner. I don't like to run. I have to actually trick my body into running by playing basketball, which I'm going to go do today. And I still do, even though I'm too old for it. Is it kind of the meditative space that you get from, like you would get from a meditation? Is it really that, or what is it about running that you really like?
It's hard to know since I haven't meditated, but I will say that two things. One, it forces me to disconnect. Maybe I'll listen to music or a podcast sometimes I don't, but I'm always in nature. I'm not a big run in the city and busyness kind of person, like where I live, just sort of overlooking Mount Tam over there.
Right, which is North Bay, if anybody's listening doesn't know where that is. It's like Marin County, just north of San Francisco, across the Golden Gate Bridge.
Oh, well, thanks. That's where I live. And we live here because our big part of it is we're really into hiking and trails and nature. And this is my dose of that at least three times a week. So I'd say that's one of the biggest part. And then the other part is just from an energy perspective, it's sort of, I just need to it's sort of I lift as well. And in both cases, it's a chance to just push yourself really hard and, sort of like how it feels cathartic to scream, but we just can't do it all the time. Well, running is my release.
I love that. You had a ton of really interesting early experiences in family, school, jobs, computer camps. How do you think that shows up in how you build products and teams now?
Excuse me. I guess there's the work side and there's the family side. And on the family side, I mentioned that job at Digital, and it was interesting. I saw my dad very much being in this incredible job that was kind of a startup that was going really well. And he was, one of the first 4 or 5 people there, and how much he loved that. But then after for some crazy shenanigans that happened with some of his boss with whatever, he ended up leaving. And I think he spent much of the rest of his career kind of trying to find something as good as that and didn't. And that was always really hard for him. And it wasn't necessarily on his fault of his own. It was just a matter of what was around, and also making sure that he put his family first in terms of needed to take care of us and so on. And I think one part of my career has been defined by just sort of being grateful and recognizing the role that I'm in right now. And, I started a company when I was 20, and I went on to then, well, started another company after I sold that first one, and then went on to Microsoft and LinkedIn. And I remember when I was leading product at LinkedIn Recruiter, it was kind of like this $2 billion business and a huge, huge opportunity and helping people to get jobs. And I just thought, oh my God, like if I do nothing else, like this is really rewarding. And I don't mean to say that I wanted to stop, but I just sort of connected it to that family position and just seeing how like I didn't expect to get this far. I'm so happy that here I am. So that was one of the big influences. I guess the other one was, on the career side, was when I was 16 years old. I wasn't sure whether I would do sort of technology. I'd always been kind of nerdy, but I've also always liked people. And I was worried that if I were a software engineer, that I would just, code all day and not talk to people. And I had this job at 16 in quality assurance. I had an office with 2 computers, and it was this early startup that was trying to replace something that ultimately, unfortunately, became part of Windows 98. But I just remember the collaboration that I had and the excitement, and having a manager that would just would keep pushing me in like really helpful and healthy ways. And there was the free Snapple at the office, and I just loved it. It was so much fun. And before that I was like, do I go into law or do I go into, but I realized both from the collaboration and from the power of that manager, like how much I did want to go into that. So I guess, yeah, the 3 things in that putting together are like the role of an amazing manager, being grateful from my dad, in terms of just seeing what the arcs that careers have, and being, just glad to have found something amazing. And then, of course, that technology is something that is social and collaborative, a team sport. It's not just about sitting down and coding away.
So you've lived at this intersection of human behavior and software for a long time. Where did that obsession start?
I mean, along with technology, sort of alluded to philosophy earlier. I remember I was reading it in like 7th grade. Like I was reading a bunch of like Lewis Carroll stuff, and 9th grade, I started getting into real philosophy. Like I've always been interested in kind of how the world works, like the big whys behind it. And some of that was philosophy, some of it was psychology, but I just kind of always had that on my mind. And right after I graduated from college, it was the .com kind of bust. It was 2002. It wasn't a good time to be in tech.
That's when I graduated as well. It was terrible.
Oh,
terrible
amazing.
time to graduate.
Yeah. And I realized, well, I wanted to do something. And I had this hypothesis that like I was very technical, and I'd observed people around me that were non-technical kind of really struggle. This is when people were starting to get into web search. This is when, Microsoft Office was clearly its heyday. It was Internet Explorer. And I was just like, what if I could help people to use technology more effectively? And, I ended up running a training company for the next 8 years. And I'd say that was really that intersection of how do you help people to get value out of technology that can make their lives better. That was really, 2002 to 2010 in some ways. And then my startup that was similar in that direction. So ever since, it's always been how to use technology as a means rather to an end. And from LinkedIn onward, I've been really close to like the future of work. So it's been also directly in that space. But yeah, to me, like some people just get excited about solving problems and building, and I love doing that. But for me, where that's really valuable is when I'm touching people's lives and hopefully making them better and giving them time back to do things that are not just technology.
Speaking of time, productivity, and work, your co-founder told me that you appeared in Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Workweek book. That definitely changed the game of productivity. What's the context there? What's the backstory?
My first company, as I mentioned, was training. It was a services company. And around 2006, I started getting involved in like blogging when it started to be a thing. I mean, I was blogging earlier, but like I started to get really serious at it. That was when I started to learn. I was in the East Coast in the DC area. And I wasn't, in Silicon Valley where everybody was talking about building products. That was when I started to think about that world, and I started to get really active in online communities. And I had a blog called Techno Theory, which was one of the top 10 blogs in productivity. And I wrote for Lifehacker and Read Write Web and a bunch of sites. And as part of that, I started hearing about Tim Ferriss being in the productivity community. And so I didn't make it into the first version of his book, but what happened is in his book, he made this thing called the Dreamline spreadsheet. Well, I guess, yeah, he actually called it the spreadsheet. And it was just this way of like figuring out how you can achieve your goals by like mapping it out using some math. And he kind of had this very rudimentary, basic way of explaining how you build a table. But our company, we were both training and like tooling and automation, particularly around Microsoft Office. We were some of the best people at Office in the world, which doesn't sound sexy, but like it's where people spent their time, and that's what mattered to me. So we built a spreadsheet, and I put it on that blog that I had. It was pretty popular. And in subsequent versions of the book, he both linked to that and also put like a page in there about me and about how we'd applied some of the lessons. So that's the story, but we got millions of downloads of that
Oh, wow.
spreadsheet. And it was sort of my first like popular product, if you will.
That's amazing. I also hear you're an avid camper and you have lots of gadgets. Tell us what are your top, 2 or 3 gadgets that everybody should have, or your favorite gadgets for camping?
Well, there's the accessible gadget and then there's the crazy ones. The accessible one is there's a product called Out In, which is this little espresso maker that you can carry around. It's like, this, it doesn't look very different than the size of a typical, thermos or whatever, or water bottle. And what you can do is you can put either an espresso capsule in it, the original line, or you can put in just some coffee, ground up. And it makes really good espresso, and it's, USB-C, just battery powered. So I got it initially for camping, but I will say that like now when I'm driving, I don't have to like pull over and stop for my caffeine fix. I bring it with me when I go to conferences if I'm not sure they're going to have espresso, because I'm a big espresso drinker. So yeah, I use that thing several times a week, even though we have it at home.
I use the AeroPress, kind of my favorite. You probably couldn't do it driving, but it makes really good coffee.
Yeah, it's the lack of grounds and the fact that I actually believe that Nespresso coffee is quite good. I'm sure some of your listeners are going to disagree that like Nespresso, how that compares to like the real deal. But
Coffee? That's great. It's great coffee. Yeah.
I really like particularly the original line. So anyway, that's one of my favorite camping express machine. I used to always have to bring like those cold like Starbucks espresso things with me in my cooler. The much less accessible, or at least not for everybody, is we have a as large as you could buy rooftop tent for our Rivian. And that,
cool.
I mean, the game with
you have the R1S, you have the big SUV.
Yeah,
okay.
The R1S.
Yeah. How do you like that?
I love it. I mean, and it self levels. So when you have a rooftop tent, like you can park a little bit, off road, if you will, and it's totally.
You get the whole family in that tent?
So we can't fit the whole family. We can fit any combination of 3. So my wife and I, and 1 kid, or 2 kids and me, etc. But really, what it does is it just makes it fast. There's no cleanup, there's no sit down. It takes 1 minute to put up, it takes 2 minutes to take down. Because the name of the game, especially with kids, is just like fast, fast, fast. If camping is something that takes a long time, you're just not going to do it as often. You're certainly not going to do a one night thing. So between that and having a kitchen that we put in the car, and then like we also have it set up so when the kids are older, they'll be able to sleep inside. We have this like bed inside that. So anyway, yeah, it's like trying to turn the Rivian into the adventure vehicle.
That's really cool. We have 2 Teslas and a minivan because we have 3 kids, as you know. I'm thinking instead of getting another Model 3, I think I'd get a Rivian. I think they're going to create a compact SUV. I don't think I need the full size. But I go dirt biking with my friends and we camp and stuff. And so having something like that with the tow hitch for the dirt bike and etc.
Yeah, I mean, with your size family, an R1's not terrible, but an R2 is, it's more like mid-size SUV as opposed to large. R1S isn't quite like Escalade territory, but it's big.
It's a pretty large, luxurious SUV. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had the Honda Pilot on a 3-year lease, and nobody drove it because it was just ginormous, and it drove like an SUV.
Similar.
Yeah,
but for camping, it's really fun for that, especially if you're going to go off road. And I'm not saying we do enough with that. The leveling is probably the best part for us, but it wins some.
That's really cool. Yeah, the leveling's key. That way you're not like waking up in the middle of the night and the blood is rushed to your head or your feet or something. Speaking of LinkedIn, I mean, that must have been a masterclass in feedback loops, network effects, incentives. What's one product lesson from that experience that most early founders underestimate?
So, I mean, LinkedIn was the first job that I had where it was a marketplace. And I think that the learning with marketplaces is that if you want to do something on the demand side, this is going to sound obvious, but like you need to make sure that you have enough supply, or that you create liquidity for whatever the feature is you want to test from supply. It's different than with, there's certain product features you have where it's like, I'm just going to add this thing and every user can suddenly benefit from it. But when you're working particularly with marketplace, or in my case, marketplace match, like, so LinkedIn Recruiter was our product, and it helped you to passively source candidates. It helps you to reach out to people like, me or something if you're looking for another product management job. And, for it to be useful, you need to create those signals on their side. So like the most impactful feature that our team built was the open to new opportunities flag, something that you now see very publicly on people's LinkedIn profiles.
Open to work. Yeah.
For years, it was not public. And even today, I don't know the numbers, but I assume most of its usage is still not public. And that
it's a good flag for me that this person's probably not a good LP.
If it's public, you mean? Or
yeah. When I go visit somebody's profile, it's like open to work. I'm like, oh, you probably don't have money then to invest in my fund.
Fair enough. Yeah. I mean, and that's the whole thing. It's like, I mean, I think the pandemic changed some of the quote stigma around whether you share that badge, but the private signal was incredibly valuable.
Yeah. For recruiters. Yeah.
But you had to build liquidity for it. You had to first get people to start raising their hand, and that takes 6 months. So I think that's one of the first things. I will say though that like when I went to Upwork, that was the first job I had where, in addition to it being a marketplace and being very data driven, it had a much faster feedback loop. So at LinkedIn, you're waiting for people to get hired. And that actually really means updating their profile. And we could talk about things we did to try to move that signal earlier or predict it, but fundamentally it was a long time. Whereas at Upwork, you have people that are doing jobs that they might do 2 jobs in a week. They might do a $50 job. If they accept a job, even if it's a high value job, like it's going to transact on your platform. Like even if they leave later, you're going to get the first checks in. So you really have the entire journey of activity through payment. So you just have much, much better feedback loop. So for all the data orientation that LinkedIn has or had, and to be clear, like they were very much like leading the industry, especially on things like machine learning. It just didn't have the kind of feedback loop that companies like Upwork or obviously Meta have. That was really what was, and I don't know if that's like a lesson learned or just like an observation, but it really changed the nature of what kind of opportunities they have. So I think that like when people hear about targeting goals as like one of the main things, I was a product manager for a really long time. It's just very different when you're in a company when you can have those really good feedback loops, or when you're building things that are really early in the funnel where there's a lot of volume. Whereas in the jobs I had before that or after that, a lot of it was more, kind of enterprise or later in the journey. So you have to be a lot more careful about how you design for sort of goals when it comes to data, since, it just takes a long time. And also leading indicators, while they are earlier in the cycle, they don't always, they're predictive, but they're not guaranteed to like get you a purchase or similar.
Yeah, shout out to Upwork. I like to tell people Team Ignite runs on AI and contractors, and most of those contractors come from Upwork. So I'm a huge fan of that platform.
It's the best. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really great. So as your scope expanded, what changed in how you made decisions, less, features and more systems design?
Excuse me. Great call. And just to give context, like at Microsoft, I was like my first PM role. Then eventually I led PMs.
What years was that at Microsoft?
I was at Microsoft. I'd like to take credit. I joined when it was $30. Yeah. I joined within months of Satya.
Nice. Okay, great. So early 2010s, basically.
Yeah, 2014. And then I stayed on at LinkedIn. So I had all this, it was a very, very lucky that I joined Microsoft at 30 and left at a few months later.
Yeah, nice work. I joined at about 100 from Amazon. And then, of course, it's up to like 400 now. So.
Totally. I mean, I wouldn't be in this house. So, but yeah, no, I joined Microsoft, and that was my first like product management opportunity, because I'd been a founder and CEO and I'd led product, but didn't have the grounding in it. LinkedIn was the first time I led like an entire product group, not just sort of mobile, which is what I did at Microsoft. And then at Upwork, I was a VP. And then in my subsequent ones, I also led the entire product organization and did presentations for the board, part of the CEO. So like with each of those things, when it came to things like strategy and goal setting, I played not just a part, but ultimately had to really drive it. And what you realize in that is like, for starters, it's all about communication. It's all about being really clear on what the target is, why the target is, what are some of the swim lanes, as opposed to, saying like, here's a feature. Like obviously taste is important and you should pick what some of your bets are. But the further I got kind of in my career and scope and teams of teams and all of that, the more it was like, how do you just make sure everybody's aligned and clear? And how do you make sure people can see that their work ladders up? That's not just true for product, but obviously across all of R&D and ideally even the rest of the company. So yeah, I think that was really the big difference. Is when you're empowering others, when it came to decision making, it was really about picking strategy, setting lanes, and then defining how people can be successful in terms of what the leading indicators. So it's less about does it fit, and it's more about like, or rather it's less about is it a feature that we support, and more about like how does it align. So it's about fitting in a system and measurable impact. So that's really about how decision making changed as things went further along.
So obviously with your 360, this isn't your first rodeo as a founder. You've been a founder before. What lessons from your first experiences as a founder you're fixing this time around?
Gosh, so many mistakes, because it wasn't just, it was my first, now I've been in big tech. So yes, it was my first time building a product company. very much learned things the long and hard way. I guess there were 3 lessons from a Wayfind that I very much have taken a different approach on with Your 360. So the first one I would say is market size. Like, we were going after email productivity. We were a tool that would notify of urgent email. So in some ways, that's a big market. But in other ways, it was very much like a personal individual user kind of thing. And to get people to kind of pay for that, if we weren't able to find a B2B approach, which you didn't in many ways ever really pull off, like, it wasn't a huge market. And we could debate about whether, like, obviously companies like Superhuman have been very successful. Most of the products in this space, like the Boomerangs or the Sane boxes or other apps, have been good businesses from like a, single digit million ARR perspective, but certainly not the unicorns that are very much the exception of like the Superhuman Grammarly thing. So I think market size was one of the big ones. I wanted to pick something that, already had people spending real money on it with a real problem. The second one is, even though like I started that business having that big blog that made me very much a market leader in terms of productivity, which is the space I was in. So I very much like had a voice, which, today, like everybody would say that's the way to do it. I did a lot, but I did a lot because it was what I'd always been doing. I didn't do a lot when it came to growth experiments because I knew that I had to do it. Like, we never did trade shows and we didn't do ads really. And one of the big lessons that I have for other entrepreneurs is like understanding kind of the power of the month, and in terms of how expensive it is to go and pay for a whole month. So if there's ways you can front load some of your costs, particularly ones around experimentation, then it means you're not paying for the whole company to get to the conclusion of all those experiments. So like, as an example, is if, let's say, your burn is $50,000 and you could run one experiment a month for within that cost, or you spend $20,000 in January, now you spend $70,000, but you have the results of those growth experiments in February or March, and now you know which ones to double down on. So like, I've, in both companies, Your 360 and Wayfind, like, got us to be like relatively talented engineering team that could build stuff. That's cool, but you need to increase your experiment velocity, particularly around things around acquiring customers, creating revenue, expansion, things like that. So this time around, very much like front loading those experiments, because even though it costs more money now, it means I'm not going to have to wait till like 6 months from now. Now, obviously, once we find the right channel, it's a different game, but like certainly experimenting early. And then the third lesson, I guess, would just be on the platform side. And we were early to mobile, and like, we built a product that would send you text messages and voice calls because there weren't apps yet when we first launched. There wasn't an ecosystem. I mean, there wasn't an app store. So obviously we built apps and so forth, but like, ultimately our product was such a good idea that, much like those early, I don't know, flashlight apps or whatever, like, it became part of iOS and part of Android. We were also early to algorithms, and we were like before the transformer doing like stuff that ultimately became product priority inbox. So we did things that were really great ideas, but they became great free ideas for Google and Apple. So there was the ground shifted underneath us. So while you can't obviously like predict exactly what's going to happen, in terms of platform shifts, I very much had a thesis about what AI ideas are defensible and which ones are just going to be replaced by the likes of, OpenAI and Anthropic. Very much took an approach to that.
Yeah, I love that. So what's the origin story behind Your 360? What is it? And kind of tell us about that transition into actually working on it.
Sure. So Your 360 is a voice AI that acts like an executive coach, and it interviews you and the people you work with most closely to get you feedback that helps you understand what are some of your strengths or superpowers, and what are some of your growth opportunities or blind spots. And it is modeled after what would happen if you had access to and $10,000 to spend on an executive coach, but it's of course done through voice AI, far less expensive and faster. And then we take those same insights that come from an individual and we can aggregate them across a team or across an entire organization. So you can find kind of these bottom up hotspots in terms of like, here are some strengths of your company or your team, and here are some of your areas you might want to work on. So we do all of that, and it's done all through voice AI. And very much the origin story, I'd say, is it's a couple parts. Like, I've been in the future of work for 10 years now. Very much wanted to work on like what gets me excited is how do you help people to be the best version of themselves at work. That's always been very much my passion. And I knew I wanted to work in that space. I also wanted to work on something where AI was going to really change the playing fields. And voice, when it comes to capturing information from people, I mean, it's just completely different. Like if this was a chat between you and I, you would have lost me, I would have lost you, and all of our readers would be gone, right? Like it's just different. Whereas in conversation, things, you can just capture a lot more, you can deliver a lot more, you can provide context, you can guide people through things. So I knew that this would be transformative. And then also with context windows growing, suddenly you could get much richer insights. But again, it was sort of that like bleeding edge of context windows expanding. So those two things, as well as all the orchestration layers that are now available, have just made it possible to really change the nature of these sort of multiplayer feedback capture, delivery, and insights.
Yeah, and one of the things that strikes me about this is kind of the market size. I'm sure you took a look at the market size as you started to build and started to think about the idea. Walk us through, because that was one of the things you wanted to change about your next startup. Walk us through how you were market sizing this opportunity.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I think there's a few different ways to size the market here. There's always like, here's where the existing market is for the exact thing we have. And then there's like, especially when you do something disruptive, like, and make it, 1/100th of the cost of the existing thing, can you expand into an additional rest of the market? So, there's sort of two different types of 360s. Generally, there's sort of performance-based and developmental. There's a lot of blurred lines, but like performance is your annual review, and developmental is, generally it's when like a coach leads it or you have like a new manager training and there's some sort of developmental 360. Those developmental ones are all in the thousands of dollars. And the performance ones are available to everybody, but they don't really work. And, there's not a lot of growth that usually comes out of it. Well under 20% of people say that those are actually effective for figuring out what you should do with your career. And when your manager's delivering a 360, they're both judge and jury. They, are responsible for your compensation. They're responsible for your placement. They're responsible for your promotion. So, you're not in a safe place to ask the hard questions, to figure out how you can, work together. And coaching and development is all about, it's like anything else that's hard. You have to struggle through it a little bit before you get to the other side. And we don't like showing that quote weakness, which isn't really weakness, but the struggle, when we're with the person who's responsible for all of our livelihood in some ways. So we felt from a market size that for starters, the exact thing that we had in terms of developmental 360s was already, very much a $1 billion market. Also roles were everything, like this is the largest HR work transformation ever happening with AI. Like 2025 and now 2026 is just completely different expectations. People are changing. There's fewer managers than before as well. So it's just a perfect storm for, how might we really help that transformation? And also, again, there's that $1 billion plus market where we have a product that is substantially better and a very small fraction of the cost, depending on which version you're comparing it to. So like we knew we had a good starting market, but where it gets really exciting is when you can reach just a lot more people, when you can get into that performance space in the sense that everybody does something every year, but do it in a way that is actually safe, do it in a way that's actually developmental for these people.
Yeah, I love that. The investor VC analogy is all the people who passed on Uber, right? Because they looked at it and they're like, I don't know what's the market really for, a black car ordering system. But what I think they failed to realize is, when you make it an order of magnitude cheaper and more convenient, the market size grows dramatically. And it sounds like that's your hypothesis with your 360 is AI, voice AI that can deliver this kind of coaching and feedback for a radically reduced price near the quality of an executive coach grows the pie dramatically.
You said it better than me. Love it.
Thanks. So, and one of the key things that you said in there, I think you slipped it in there, which is the psychological safety, the design around AI as the interviewer and the transparency that the interviewee, the employee in this case, so that seeking feedback and development could speak more open. What surprised you most as you started listening to these conversations? What patterns, emotions, and blind spots came up?
So I guess I'll touch on two things. I'll touch first on like voice AI and sort of how it works, just to give your listeners a little bit of context on it, and then touch on, what surprised me when it actually started to come to life with real customers. So first off, we are riding a wave of being comfortable sharing with AI, like whether it be how we just spend time in ChatGPT throwing in company data, or questions about how we should approach a situation with our partner or family, or questions about our health. So like, I think that is something that we're lucky to have been a part of, where people feel like they can share. But when it comes to voice 360s or just coaching in the workplace, the alternative is generally one's manager. Maybe you're lucky to have a mentor or peer you can trust, but generally it is, especially with capturing feedback, 9 times out of 10, it goes through one's manager. And I already shared the challenges with that around compensation, placement, and promotion. So for voice AI, or just in general in capturing feedback, the ideal is to have someone that's neutral, that's not motivated, that doesn't have a conflict of interest in terms of why they're trying to help you, where their motivation isn't for their own promotion or for the company's bottom line, but is instead for developing you. So having a coach in the middle, in our case, a voice AI coach, makes a tremendous difference. Now, where voice AI comes in for that is both in terms of how we can capture things more effectively than a survey, and also just capture things more effectively than a manager. So for starters, when it's with voice, people tend to be expansive. They're not, sort of self-editing. And also the AI is able to very much probe in terms of taking their feedback and making it much more specific and actionable. And it can ask questions like, well, why is this important for Brian to work on this? How is it going to help his podcast? How is it going to help his fund? What would you do if you were in his shoes? Things like that. So you can really get probing and personalized. So the capturing is much better for starters. And then in terms of the delivery, the coach can walk you through things in a way where they can really help you to reflect on things. And that's, it's helpful for the growth areas, but it's also really helpful for strengths, because if you don't really spend time working through the areas where you are a rock star, then when you get to the negative stuff, you don't have any foundation upon which it's built. And no surprise, many of our growth areas are also things where it's just a flip of the coin in terms of our strengths. And our voice AI coach is very good at helping people to see both sides of that coin and how they can leverage their strengths for their growth areas, and also to help them to take those growth areas as sort of like as a gift, like that, when you receive a gift, it's the thought that counts. It's not the fact that it's the perfect gift for what you would have bought if you had $100 for Amazon, So how do you choose what to actually work on and just say, hey, certain things, no, this doesn't matter to me, or I should outsource it to Upwork or whatever, it really puts things in context. So that's really where a lot of the safety comes in. And that's where voice AI is particularly well. And it's not different than really a coach. It's just that it is far less expensive. And I guess it's also like, doesn't beat around the bush. There's no small talk. It's just immediate. And then I'll get to your surprising thing, but looked like you had a question first.
I have all kinds of questions, but yeah, go ahead and finish.
Okay. So on the surprising thing, when we first built this product, we knew there was going to that coaches debrief on 360s, and that like you have a 3 times greater success rate in terms of people feeling an impact if like it goes from like 30% to like over 90% when a coach delivers a 360. So that's really important. But I was nervous about that. Like there wasn't some sort of analogy to like just voice mode on ChatGPT. This was an immersive experience where somebody's talking over a document, and it can take a while. So like we based our methodology on kind of like Hudson Coaching Institute, on one of our advisors, Rebecca Glenn, who like literally wrote the book on this, on Interview 360s. And she recorded the first 360s that came out of our product, where she would deliver them to those recipients, and we would, record it over Zoom, and then we would base our AI on it. The very first time we put somebody through it, besides like me going through it, I just really didn't know what to expect. And the product like cut out at 60 minutes. And I didn't know why at first. And we realized that she was talking, our Coach Tam, was talking to this recipient for more than an hour, but we had like this hard limit in our product at an hour. We just never thought, it didn't even cross our minds that people would want to spend more than an hour talking to a voice AI. But since then, it's gone well past that. Like most people are like 40 minutes, but we had somebody do over 90 minutes this like a week or two ago. And like, yeah, it blew my mind. So that was what surprised me, is that, it doesn't take very long to like listen to the coach talk over the 360, but it does take a long time if you want to share lots of stories and you want to be vulnerable and you want to ask a lot of questions, which is what in theory you do with a human coach. And they are very much doing it with our coach. And that absolutely blew my mind. I mean, the reason we did this is for people to have transformative experiences, to have far greater self-awareness you're going to get from like a Briggs or a Big Five or a Five Dynamics, but we didn't know like that we would get to see it so vividly and so early. And yeah, it just far exceeded our expectations. That people really, if you want to grow, then you need to, I don't want to say struggle again, but you need to, it's called meaning making in coaching. You need to make meaning from this information. You can't just gloss over it. You don't just want it to send you to, a dark place from the negative feedback, and you don't want to just put it on the shelf and just ignore it. So the fact that they were doing that, and from our very first version, yeah, we're delighted.
That's amazing. And Coach Tam being the actual anthropomorphizing the actual AI here. The name of the AI is Coach Tam. And
Exactly.
how does it work? So for some people listening, they're probably thinking like, wow, this sounds really cool for my company. What's the implementation look like? How many colleagues do I need to be interviewed? Yeah, how does it all work in practice?
Yeah, so we have two products. We have the individual 360, and then we have kind of the team and group insights that go on top of it. But it all starts with that individual 360. And it's a 3-step process where you talk to the coach and you share some of the, a little bit about yourself, your current role. If you know what you're working on, you can share it. If you're not sure, you can kind of talk about it and figure it out together. And then you could just choose who the colleagues are that you give feedback, or she can help you. A lot of times companies are assigning these to folks and they haven't thought about their growth areas or why they're doing this, or who they should ask. So the product can really help you with that. And for individual contributors, for ICs, we recommend 4 people so that you can have sort of anonymized feedback amongst one group of those 3, and then attributed feedback from your manager. And then for managers, we recommend 7 so that you can have like all your direct reports can count as one group, and you can get some feedback. So you don't know which direct report, but you can anonymize that. And then similarly, another bucket and your manager. And the more feedback you get, the better. So like we've let people through with 3. That's like the sort of bare minimum. But the more feedback that is captured, the more you can feel confident that there's a pattern. And that's really the issue. So it's not just about getting feedback. It's about believing in the feedback, and that it's not just a one-off, that it's not one person that's just having a bad day. So it's those patterns that, and that's what makes our product so different. In other products, well, pretty much every product in the market before Voice AI, pick your competitor who I won't name, they're very quantitative based. So the only patterns they can do are just, you're a 7.4 average. Oh, well, great. Well, what is 7 for? Nobody standardized these Likert scales. Whereas for us, we can say, well, no, everybody says that you tend to interrupt in meetings, or that you talk over, or that, you don't have time for developing your whatever it happens to be. We'll find those explicit patterns and really raise them up. There's not a lot of room for interpretation in there. I mean, obviously you still get to decide what matters and how to take it, but like it's just much more clear. So anyway, that's step 1 was the onboarding. Step 2, where you talk to the coach. Step 2 is where we collect the feedback. It takes about 15 minutes per person that's giving feedback. They can either do it over the phone, or they can do it through a web interface. And then step 3 is where we do a debrief. That's where I mentioned that 60-minute experience where people talk to our voice AI while she walks them through that report. And, I don't want to say force, but like she has an agenda, and it's going to be, you're going to think about your strengths. You're going to reflect on how awesome you are before you get to that next section. And we cover 3 things. We cover your strengths, your growth areas, and then also any area that you probed on or that your company probed on. So if you're working on presentations for the board, if you're working on a culture of inclusivity, if your company says we want to know which value Brian exemplifies most at his company, like those types of things, we bring that into that last section. And as you're hearing, like all these things can also be kind of customized by companies in terms of if they skip some of these stages, or if they do it differently, or if they customize it. But the core of it is like that 3-step process. That's the most developmentally sound process that's happened for more than 30 years with executive coaches.
That's amazing. So one thing you probably experience as you sell in enterprises is, questions around your SOC 2 compliance and your privacy and data retention. And where do you think the industry gets this wrong? And how are you guys thinking through this issue?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So, I mean, there's kind of 2 frames to this. So one part of it is how a customer manages their employee data, since this is, people stuff, right? Like this is people's careers. Like this isn't just, how you manage your IP, right? And the second side of it is how we as a company manage data. And I think that the first one's actually more important in the sense that, when people are sharing, it's really important that they understand the context in which they're sharing. This is both people providing feedback in terms of how is this going to be used, and also that, recipient that's walking through that experience knowing that they can share openly and that it's not going to be used against them. We but that being said, people sometimes do use this where they share it with their manager, or they might share it with HR. They have different purposes. We were talking to a customer today who has a 360 process where they don't even have like the employee necessarily see it. And as a matter of fact, I don't know about you at Amazon, but certainly me at Microsoft or LinkedIn or Upwork, people called it a 360, but feedback went to the manager, and then the manager filtered what they want to the employee. So like,
yeah, we did this at Microsoft. I was at Microsoft 2019 to 2023.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was manager there of a pretty large org, and so pretty familiar with it, both from being an IC there and a manager. And we did the 360s of head of people conversations, but they were very much surveys, right? And it was up to the employee to go out and gather those, and they were submitted in some portal, and the manager would read them and say, "This is what your peers said,"
Connect, actually, I think Microsoft had that. I don't know if
it
had when you were there, and Microsoft is kind of forward looking because Connect was developmental. But because of these different use cases for it, what's most important is that we allow our customers to kind of set some of the ways they might use it, so that when we capture feedback or when people interact with the product, they know that that's how it's going to be used. So the most important thing when it comes to how data takes place for people data within a company is that you're transparent about it, as opposed to just you have only one setting, but then you use it in a way that's contrary to it. So we give customers some of those options so that they really understand how this data is going to be used. And then the second part of it, you got into compliance and SOC 2 and data retention. I mean, we have a privacy policy, of course, where we talk about how long we hold on to the recordings through the life of, while they're going through the process, and then a short period after, and how long we hold on to the transcripts and so forth. And for companies, if they want to shorten some of those things, we can, but really it's all designed around how do we make sure we have that information long enough for us to use it to make sure that you have the most accurate, truthful information. And also, if you want to run a subsequent process, that we can utilize that so you can sort of show whether there's been growth. We don't use data from one company for another company in terms of any of the content. The only thing that changes over time is we get better at those calls. So like if we have evals that pay attention to all of our calls, and also sort of as regression tests to make sure we make changes that it works against representative calls. But all of that is really about like making sure that the process works. The actual data, as of now, we're not doing any benchmarking of like product managers or mid-sized companies or whatever. We might do something like that. And of course, we'd pay attention to how to anonymize appropriately. But in general, the substance is not anything that gets shared across borders. It's really just making sure that it works.
Lots of founders that listen to this podcast, what's the biggest trap they fall into when building an HR tech?
I think the biggest challenge in building an HR tech, this is true of founders or anybody kind of new to the space, is that, we that are sort of drawn to this space are not necessarily like everybody else. We are often lifelong learners. We might be the kind of person that would take a Coursera course or, maybe even read the manual, right? That's just a small portion of people that are willing to take the time to develop personally. The learning space in particular is generally more of a vitamin than a pain pill, right? I mean, if you're doing something with a compliance angle, like if you're in medicine and you need to stay up to date on safety procedures, or if you're a forklift operator and need to how to move this, and pass that test, like those are ones where people both respect it and understand it. There's other compliance things that some people don't always agree with, but fundamentally, if you're not in compliance, then learning is something that it's just hard to get people to do. And it's well under 10% of the population that is going to be motivated. So what that means is that it's just a harder space. You have to recognize that whatever that kind of N is that you're multiplying to, have the right unit economics, that it's gonna work out. So it's sort of like how I mentioned with our coach that people spend 60 minutes. Some people will spend 25 minutes and they'll just get through it. And it's to them, it's a rote activity. And while that is thankfully the exception for who's used our product, like I totally get it. Not everybody is, they didn't sign up for it. Someone else at their company did, and they are getting some value out of it. But it's just, you get out what you put in, but at the same time, it's just not for everybody. So I think that's the that is the challenge that that when people enter this space, they may be a little bit naive about everybody's desire to self-improve. And that's true in productivity as well. Obviously, with productivity, there are certain productivity tools you have to use, like Slack, but like a lot of the productivity tools that are more like better task management or email productivity or whatever, those are nice to haves as well. And that can be challenging.
Let's talk a little bit about the future. So, management is changing. AI is absorbing tasks. Roles are getting reshaped. What are, new career survival skills that matter most in the next 3 to 5 years?
Great question. There's obviously the you need to work better with AI thing. So I'll sort of spare you there. Everybody needs to be current with it. Everybody needs to get comfortable. I mean, some of the things that matter most are how you translate between stakeholders, how you work with people, how you have the soft skills to navigate an organization and work with conflicting priorities and conflicting goals, which is related to another thing, which is just being able to prioritize. So if you are somebody that can tease what matters out of the room and across and among, and also with like all these different data sources of types of feedback or requests, even if it's just from your boss, even if you're not like a product manager, you're just told one thing to do, being able to filter for the thing that you think is going to make the biggest impact. Now, using, of course, AI to help you with that, but ultimately you're the decider on that. Those are some of the things that really matter. And another thing is bringing things all the way through, being an owner. So if you're the kind of person that can not just get things to the idea, from through the idea stage or to the prototype, but can really get well past the AI slop and actually bring it to something that's going to matter in the market, that's going to resonate with people. That last 5% that goes from what is like sounds good to what actually is good. We obviously call that taste a lot when we're talking about AI. Like that really matters. And when it comes to what I advise of folks is generally like, how can you be a spiky generalist? How can you be the kind of person that understands wide enough to be able to like get something to the finish line where they understand every element of it, but also has a particular area where they're really, really strong, where their taste is the sharpest. And hopefully that correlates with the value of whatever is happening.
So as you put yourself out there 5 or 10 years in the future, imagine you've, built everything you wanted to build for your 360 or most of it. What does that future vision look like? You accomplished a lot. What is it? And what are you proud of?
I don't know about you, Brian, but I can certainly look back on some moments. Maybe I'll ask you, can you think of a moment where somebody really created an inflection in your career, where there's some feedback you received that changed something for you?
No, because I never stuck around long enough to hear the feedback. Okay. Because if something wasn't working for me, I would just quit and try something else. And so I always kind of listened to my internal compass a lot more than what people were saying. Yeah. And maybe that's a weakness, actually.
Well, I can say like there's been some moments, it's not most moments, of course, but every few years there's something that someone shared with me, whether it be feedback from me or advice on how to work with a situation, where it really changed how I approached, kind of my career, or really changed how I approached how I showed up. And what I want is 10 years from now to look back and say that your 360 did exactly that for millions of people, to be a product that didn't just quote do its job and like show ROI for companies, but one where people said this was really their inflection point. And we've talked to a lot of our customers where that's very much been the case. And I've talked to a lot of other people where their 360, sometime in the last 20 years, it did that for them. And that's really our ambition, is to bring that kind of feedback to not just the people who are lucky enough to get provided a really great, unbiased developmental 360 from their company that cost thousands of dollars, but to really bring it to, all of the workforce. That's our ambition.
Yeah, I love it. Well, let's wrap up with some rapidish fire questions. I say rapidish because you can take as long as you want, but what's a belief you held strongly as a product leader or founder 5 or 10 years ago that you have now rethought or you've changed your mind on?
If you asked me this a few years ago, I probably would have just talked about the revolving PM role or something, which is what I was doing. But now it's hard to answer this without, talking about how AI is changing the nature of work. And I'd say 2 things have really changed. One is obviously roles have collapsed. Designers are doing product is doing design and engineers are doing product. This whole builder hiring thing that we talk about with like LinkedIn is hiring these PMs that are builders first, if you will. So, I mean, like, I think that, I was, again, a product leader for a long time. And I think that the core responsibilities in that space remain around things like accountability without authority and prioritization and tracking toward results. But really what's different is, that ownership went from here as a spiky generalist to like all across, so that you need to be a toe stepper today. Like before, it might have been like a cultural value at some companies that you kind of step on toes every once in a while, but now if you're not putting together some designs as part of your work, or if you're not shipping something that shows how it really works, or pick the equivalent of that across all of the functions, then you're not either general enough or you're not spiky enough in terms of doing those things. And then I guess the second thing that I think is really different, I think people could get away before with being non-technical, but now we have to kind of change our opinion of what that word means. So, last year, I think of 2025 as the year of AI being real for R&D, in the sense that like there's nobody that would want to use an IDE like Cursor or, VS Code or whatever without having AI assisting in it, because it just 100% of people will get value out of it. And I think that in the back half of 2025, the prototyping became a lot more real. Design and PM got a lot more real, not just like pasting something into ChatGPT, but like real workflows. I think that there was a lot of sizzle though in 2025 when it came to go to market and to company operations. I think this is the year where that's going to become, and has started to become, real. And part of the reason for that is that the reason why things like Cursor and, whatever was before, wasn't accessible is because you still needed to have some understanding of kind of that taste applied to code, because you needed to understand like what the diffs meant. You needed to understand what was happening. And now, because the quality is getting there, with tools like Claude Cowork, you don't need that anymore. So people are going to actually be able to trust that the quality is of a high enough level, even quality around things like communication and outreach. Obviously, personalization and things help. But yeah, just fundamentally, 26 is about the rest of the organization bringing AI to life. And that means that you don't necessarily need to be truly technical, because again, you're not necessarily looking at code, but it does mean that you need to think about how you connect processes. It means you need to try things you haven't tried before. It means just going outside of your comfort zone with something that may not be hard technology, but is technology. And I think that that's harder. It's somewhat expected when you're an engineer, but it needs to be everywhere.
Yeah, I love that. The blurring of lines. You've been thinking about productivity for a really long time. As we record this early 2026, you mentioned Claude Cowork. Obviously, there's a lot of chatter around Claude Bot right now. What are you excited about? What are you kind of using in your productivity stack? And what are things that it has unlocked for you?
I am excited about Claude Bot. I'm not using it, but that idea of a true AI assistant that has access to everything, oh my God, it's coming. You have to decide whether you're on the true bleeding edge of everything or whether you wait just a little bit. But I use Cursor and Claude Code, right? Use it both for building prototypes and working in the product and so forth, as well as building little small agents, usually more point in time than running in the background.
What about Cowork? You've actually messed around with that. I haven't messed around with that yet.
So believe it or not, I'm not on a Mac, so I can't use Cowork.
Not on a Mac either. So
it's not available to us then, Brian. But I do use Claude Code. And honestly, I think that, at least for somebody like me who's reasonably technical, Claude Cowork, from my understanding, is a bit more of a front end and opinion, training wheels, if you will, around Claude Code. So if I can use Claude Code, which I can, I'd rather become expert at sort of the full engine as opposed to the training wheels. And I think Claude Code will continue to get, we'll see what the future holds, who knows, but I think it's the right abstraction layer for me. It's similar. It's like I'm more of an N8N guy than a relay guy. No shame to that or Zapier or whatever, but I would rather have a little bit more flexibility and learn how to work with that flexibility. That's just sort of where I am in my comfort zone. Whereas for others, having a closer or higher abstraction layer makes sense for them, even though there's different constraints.
Yeah, I'm waiting. It's funny because I'm such a technologist, but I'm not a truly early adopter. I'm very much a nerd on a PC and Android, which I think puts me squarely in the nerd camp. But I tend to be kind of like an early majority adopter, if that makes sense. I was definitely there at ChatGPT when it came out. I was messing around with it. I guess I was probably in the very early adopter group. But things like Claude Bot, Claude Cowork, definitely have. I've been hearing about it. I want to use it, but I will probably wait another quarter or two until it's really polished. and everybody's like, oh, if you're not using it, you're behind. Great. That's like about the time that I'll jump in and kind of use it.
Well, I mean, that totally makes sense. And I'm definitely in that place with certain tools. I think like, when you look at the world of Lovable and Bolts, and then obviously like the cursors and windsurfs, and like, they're all relatively easy to use right now. They're much, much better than they were 6 months ago, 3 months ago. Really what Claude Code is doing is it's just making it easier to do things that are not just stuff that looks like websites, but are actually like operations. And that's
Full
because
stack applications.
yeah, well, not even applications. I mean, it's more yes, they are applications, but really what it is, it's the series of connectors via MCP to other data stores and activities that could take place on your computer or on the web. And then it's similarly, it's the fact that it can do more without you worrying about, like it can keep going without you having to like see all the in-between stages. I don't know that it's like the best explanation, but I guess what I'm getting at here is if there's something that you find you are doing on a regular basis, I would open up something like a Claude Code or Cursor, honestly, and just ask it to do that thing. Lovables and Bolts today, those won't do that. Those are the thing, but it is as accessible as those tools 6 or 9 months ago.
Right.
Claude Bot's a whole different thing. That's a bit more bleeding edge. That's an open source framework that's getting a lot of work, but like, that's different. I'm not comfortable enough to like dive deep in there yet, just based on my own understanding and knowledge. But Claude Code, yes, that's mature enough for you to, or CoWork because it's based on Claude Code. I wouldn't be surprised if you could do something that I know you do a lot of like volume as part of, the outreach you do to, whether you're raising capital or putting out a deal or learning about somebody you're about to speak with for this. Those are really good tasks for kind of automating.
Yeah. I have lots of little venture capital is a lot of repetitive stuff, like it's a very repetitive in a way, in a good way. Like I love it. Like I love meeting founders, and that's the variability part of it. Cause you meet a founder and like, sometimes you're like, this is the most amazing thing. Take my money. And sometimes I would never invest in this and everything in between. That's the fun part of venture, but there's lots of repetitive, like, okay, I've decided to start due diligence. Please send me your data room. Now I look through the data room and I ask you questions about the data room and I verify everything you said. And then I wire the money and then I help you. And there's like very repetitive things that I feel like something like ClaudeBot could automate a lot of that for me. And right now I use kind of a combination of basically copying and pasting into ChatGPT, contractors, AI, some software, some Airtable, but I'm looking forward to this full-blown agentic, CloudBot, Claude Code kind of thing where I can just say, here's this repetitive task I do over and over again. Please just design a system for me that will take that off our plate completely. Yeah, that's kind of where software is going. Anyway, tell us about a product decision you made that either looked wrong or right in the moment, but later proved the opposite.
I think many of the places that I've worked at, I've had kind of my like hill to die on, if you will. One of the ones that worked out well for me when I was at Microsoft, as I mentioned, I was leading mobile for a product that was called Link, about a $2 billion business, but I was
Link, yeah.
For mobile.
It
became Skype for Business, and then it became Microsoft Teams. So when we think about Teams doing so well and being this sort of nascent baby, it actually never was a nascent baby. It was part of the largest company business in the world, competing only with Cisco. But anyhow, like that product, I was responsible for mobile, and we had a really big internal debate where I put together quite a large memo on.
Well, at Microsoft, it was a PowerPoint.
It actually, was a document that I wrote.
It was a doc. Wow.
But I'm with you. It could have very well been a PowerPoint.
I remember when I was there, we had these like 100-page, 150-page PowerPoints on all the projects we're doing. Yeah, it was crazy.
But I remember this vividly. This was a doc that I put together and shared with Zig Serafin, who went on to be the CEO of Qualtrics for a number of years. It was all about whether the default experience for, at the time, I think it was Skype for Business, might have been Link, should be VoIP or PSTN fallback. In other words, like when you go to make a call from your mobile phone, should it do it like FaceTime audio does, or should it call your phone like as a real regular phone call and talk to them? And it was a good debate because like we had customers that were multi-billion-dollar companies that were paying us a lot of money, and if they use VoIP, like they go through a dead zone, all of a sudden they lose their call. So there was a reason to be conservative, but I really pushed hard that VoIP is where we needed to be, because of 100 reasons, whether it be that you want to see the attendees or you want to see the screen share. or, better fidelity, or if you want augmentation, like transcription, blah, blah, blah. And like, it was a really big debate. And I really proposed that we should have a fallback mechanism to PSTN when there were issues detected, but that we shouldn't default to it. And ultimately, I guess you could say I won that debate in the sense that that's what we shipped, but also over the test of time, with 5G LTE and like the norms around things like WhatsApp and FaceTime, that's clearly been the direction. And I'm really glad that we went with it. But I mean, again, like I had really good experience at Microsoft in terms of, people listening to data and listening to logic and so forth. And Zig took a chance on me with this really big product decision, and we wrote a great fallback experience that was like defining, and that's something that you could never do in most products because you don't have a phone line available to make an outbound call.
Yeah,
we did.
It still is the design paradigm for that experience, right? A VoIP first, and then the landline is the fallback.
Yeah, and usually landline as a fallback is like you hit a button, you have to dial in. But for us, it was after 5 seconds, it would have this really nice like opt-in flow, or then it would do it at a certain point, all based on like, if there's something that, people don't give Teams a lot of credit, but like it was all the Skype engineers and it was all the Skype technology, both from a chat and from a voice perspective. And they were the best in the world at that stuff. So yeah, we could, had a lot of voice engineers that really understood fidelity.
That's awesome. Last question. What's an AI plus work narrative you think is overhyped right now and one that's underappreciated?
I think to some extent I already answered this, because when you talked about, what to focus on, and I talked about the 2025, 2026 thing, because I think that what was overhyped last year was how there was like all the AI SDRs and all of the like insane N8N flows and Zapier flows or whatever. And I just think that stuff was pretty darn inaccessible to people. That was a lot of, I don't want to say snake oil, but a lot of people, it just looked so easy, but it really wasn't happening. I mean, honestly, I think that's why people that have found really good forward deployed engineers have had a lot of success, and people that have had to roll up their sleeves, especially when they're outside of R&D, have like that's where the struggle and success has been. But I think 2026 is going to be the year where some of this stuff is available without forward deployed engineers, or they're going to be standard enough and common enough that people that are not, buying 6-figure purchases will have access to them. So yeah, I think that like it was overhyped last year, that 2026 is going to be a year that this is going to really happen.
Love it. So if listeners got to this point, they're probably pretty interested. Where can they find you online? And I see it on your shirt. Maybe you could, for listeners driving in their car, how can they find how to do this, and what should they tell their boss?
Well, of course, you can find our product at your360.ai. You can find me on LinkedIn/in/Goralnick, my last name, or just look me up. If you're looking to be that outlier, incredibly successful member of the team, then you need the feedback that's going to unlock that opportunity. And they don't need to be that amazing coach boss that they may not have the time to be. They can just spend a few $100s and do that and bring that to you, and ideally bring it to your team so you can figure out exactly how the team can come together, not just as individuals, but as a group. And similarly, if you're not a fan of the reviews that you have every year, there's much better opportunities out there that are psychologically safe, that actually develop your team and that give your organization the context for, what are the next steps to really, reach that escape velocity.
Awesome. Well, really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much for spending time.
Thanks, Brian. It was a blast.
Thank you.